Do you remember the sound of the school bell in the 1970s? It wasn't just a signal to move on to the next lesson. It carried a weight that settled in your stomach the moment it rang. Corridors fell quiet, shoes shuffled into lines, and everyone seemed to stand a little straighter. Back then, that bell marked order, expectation, and a set of rules that were rarely questioned. Today, a bell is just background noise, but then it felt like authority made audible. What's surprising now is how ordinary those routines were, how accepted they seemed at the time. Practices that would spark debate today were once part of daily life, barely worth a second thought. This story isn't about shock for the sake of it, but memory. Because when you listen closely, that old bell still echoes, inviting us back to a classroom world most people have quietly forgotten. To understand why schools felt so strict, we have to step back into Britain, as it was in the 1970s. Many families were still shaped by post-war habits, where routine, politeness, and knowing your place were seen as strengths. Parents trusted institutions, and schools sat high on that list. Teachers were not just educators, they were guardians of behavior, expected to prepare children for a world of timetables, factories, offices, and rules. Classrooms were often crowded, resources stretched thin, and there was little room for individual tailoring. A single teacher might be responsible for 30 or more pupils, all expected to move together, learn together, and behave together. Clear rules were the simplest way to keep order, and order was believed to lead to success. If something worked for previous generations, it was rarely challenged. Today we talk about choice, conversation, and understanding the child as an individual. Back then, the focus was on fitting in and doing as you were told. Questions were fewer, explanations shorter, and expectations unambiguous. This wasn't cruelty. It was confidence in a system that promised stability. And within that world of certainty, school discipline became less about debate and more about duty, setting the stage for the routines we remember so clearly. It was a shared understanding between home and school, reinforced daily, quietly shaping behavior without lengthy discussion. That unspoken agreement explains why discipline felt firm, predictable, and normal, forming the background hum of childhood for an entire generation in those years together. The daily rhythm of a 1970s school day was governed by rules so familiar they almost disappeared into the background. Assembly meant silence, rows perfectly aligned, hands by sides, eyes forward. Uniforms were inspected with quiet precision, from polished shoes to neatly tucked shirts, because appearance was believed to reflect character. Inside the classroom, chairs scraped across wooden floors as everyone stood together. When an adult entered, a small ritual repeated so often it became automatic. There was chalk dust in the air, clinging to sleeves and settling on desks. While handwriting was practiced carefully, line by line, exercise books returned marked in bold red pen, corrections clear and unquestioned. Instructions were not invitations, they were statements. When a task was set, it was done the same way by everyone, at the same pace, without debate. Detentions, when they happened, were accepted as part of the system, rather than something to challenge. Queues formed for everything, entering classrooms, lining up for lessons, even waiting to leave at the end of the day. Order wasn't discussed, it was demonstrated. These routines created a shared understanding of how school worked and what was expected of you. Most people today have no idea this was once standard, woven into everyday life without comment. Yet for those who lived it, these rules felt as natural as the timetable itself. They shaped habits, posture, and attitudes, long before anyone questioned their purpose, preparing children for a wider world where conformity still mattered greatly. In that environment, consistency offered comfort, even when it felt rigid, because everyone knew the boundaries and consequences. Looking back now, it's striking how rarely those systems were explained, only enforced, leaving memories that feel strict today but strangely reassuring when recalled decades later by many who lived through it at school. Teachers in the 1970s occupied a place that feels almost unfamiliar now. They were addressed formally, never by first names, and that distance mattered. When a teacher spoke, the room listened. Eye contact was steady, backs were straight, and decisions were rarely explained, let alone debated. Authority was part of the role, worn like a uniform you didn't question. Most lessons followed a clear pattern, led firmly from the front of the room. Instructions came once, and it was assumed they would be followed. If a pupil disagreed or felt confused, it was usually kept quiet. Speaking up carried risk, so most learned to observe, absorb, and comply. Respect wasn't negotiated. It was expected instantly. Today's classrooms feel very different. Teachers encourage discussion, invite opinions, and explain the reasons behind rules. Relationships are warmer, names are shared, and learning is often a conversation rather than a command. Neither approach exists in isolation from its time, but remembering that older style helps explain why school once felt so serious, so formal, and so clearly structured. It shaped how many learned to listen, wait their turn, and accept instruction without question, habits that followed them well beyond the classroom walls for decades. This is the moment where memory softens and judgment gently steps aside. Looking back, many of us realize those strict routines gave us something solid to lean on. Days had shape, expectations were clear, and there was comfort in knowing exactly where the lines were drawn. We learned punctuality, patience, and how to wait our turn without being reminded twice. For some, that structure became a quiet strength carried into work, family life, and the wider world. But it didn't teach everything. Creativity often had to fit inside narrow margins, and quieter personalities could disappear into the background. Not every child thrived in silence or order, and not every question found space to be asked. Individuality existed, but it waited patiently for the school gates to open at the end of the day. Still, there was a shared understanding, a collective rhythm to growing up then. We were shaped by the same bells, the same rules, the same expectations. This wasn't just about classrooms or authority. It was about learning who we were in a Britain that valued conformity before expression. And that makes the comparison with today all the more striking. Those lessons linger, echoing whenever we look back. Looking at schools today, it's clear that the world, which shaped 1970s discipline, has moved on. Modern classrooms place the child at the center, with care, conversation, and well-being guiding every decision. Safeguarding, understanding, and flexibility now define good teaching, where once firmness and routine did the job. It isn't about saying one era was right and the other wrong. They simply reflect different times, different hopes, different fears. Perhaps that's why these memories still matter. They remind us how far society has traveled and invite us to smile, remember, and share our own school day moments before they quietly fade.